All right, as she said, that's our lengthy title, so we'll pass through that. I think as anyone who's read anything in the news knows, there's a lot going on in the destructive malware realm. There's a lot going on as far as geopolitical conflict. What happens rarely, though, is actually seeing these two together and seeing how the interplay between them. And so that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. And also looking at over the course of really the last decade or so, it's not necessarily a new phenomena. There have been a ton, even over the last month, saying there's this new wiper malware. There's never been before been anything like this. We're going to show that's not necessarily as new as everyone's saying, but these pieces in the puzzle have not necessarily been put together in a coherent, strategic way. And so that's what we'll be doing, and basically show that's how we've gone to 2017, where there's a lot of interesting things going on, to say the least. I'll cruise through this really quickly, just who we are, just to show we both work at Endgame. Both have experience in the government, but from the IC and the DoD perspectives. But we take it different perspectives. Mine, I'm a quantitative international relations background, so formal modeling and conflict. And Mark has an InfoSec background, and so we're bringing those two together and bringing those two perspectives together in a way, actually, that Allison talked about a little bit during her keynote, as far as blending the social sciences with the information security. I'll pass it on to Mark.
All right, cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just a background on what destructive attacks have we seen over the last 7 or 8 years, and what are the differences between these things, what are some of the commonalities, what are some of the emergent themes. So I've bin these things into two main categories, like what's a destructive attack. The first type of attack, it really involves just destruction of data, destruction of hard drives, logical destruction. These are the sorts of things, overwriting of files, destruction of a master boot record. A lot of you in this room probably would say, what do we got here? Sorry. I'm not doing it right, apparently. Sorry about that. So destruction of data is kind of the first step. And you might think that's not that big a deal. What would be the impact of an attack like that, which might be successful? Well, it's easy to restore the data on one computer if you have a backup and repartition a hard drive, you're back in business. But when you're talking about coordinated attacks across sometimes tens of thousands of machines, that can actually lead to some very severe real-world impacts as secondary effects. So we're going to talk about some attacks of that nature. The other type of destructive attack is really more about using cyber access and cyber means to directly manipulate things in the physical world, usually by taking advantage of industrial control systems components and modifying the way certain systems are operating, the electric grid, other components. And that kind of starts us off with Stuxnet, which I bet everyone in this room has heard about, remains one of the, if not the most advanced and complex attack that created a physical real-world effect. In this case, just quick background, if you haven't heard of this, the Iranian nuclear program has been something of great concern for a very long time. There's a lot of thought thinking, hey, they're pursuing a bomb. To build a bomb, you need lots of fissile material, enriched uranium or something else. And so they have a lot of centrifuges, which are spinning around trying to separate atoms and create fissile material. So those actual centrifuges were the subject of a cyber attack called Stuxnet. Very advanced campaign, access through USB drives, supposedly, got onto systems, up to 4 0 days built into this software in order to do propagation and look for programmable logic controllers, PLCs, which were what the attackers were intending to get onto and then create some real-world manipulative effects, with great knowledge of the actual system, implying lots of reconnaissance before the attack, which is a theme you'll see throughout some of these. Things were manipulated, and allegedly up to 20% of the centrifuges in the program were destroyed, basically modified through cyber means to make themselves effectively explode, self-destruct, causing a real-world impact. So that was sort of the first time we saw that sort of effect, somebody reaching through the internet and causing this to happen. So jump forward 2 years, Iran was the target again using of some malware called Flame. This particular malware was one of the biggest packages we've ever seen, about 20 megs in size. Had a lot of really advanced espionage components in that malware, do things like, screen grabs, audio capture, like recording conversations, things like that. Also had a wiper component in the malware. So, again, a lot of propagation techniques in there as well to burrow through networks in an automated way and take some kind of effect broadly. This wiper component took out Iranian oil targets. The Iranians had to allegedly take a bunch of actual production facilities offline. Unclear if that was because of the attack or if it was a precautionary measure. I'm not aware of how that exactly went down. But things came offline. So again, this was an attack where manipulation of hard drives, data destruction, and MBR overwrites led to some kind of real-world effect on the oil production. Similar attack happened later, something called Shamoon. this targeted a Saudi oil production facility. Just a quick question: who here has been part of a cyber incident that happened on a weekend or on a Friday night and kind of wrecked your day? Yeah, I have. That sucks. Happens all the time. You see that also with these destructive attacks, and this was a time when this was a real theme. They launched this attack, supposedly the Iranians against the Saudis, on the eve before a major religious holiday in Saudi Arabia. So that wrecked a lot of people's holiday long week. In this case, all data was overwritten with a nice little picture of a burning American flag, master boot records destroyed. This malware was hard-coded with admin credentials, which were used to create remote admin shares, malware copied across, and then a scheduled task to destroy data at 11:08 a.m. before this religious holiday. So coordinated, wide-scale effect, 30,000 computers supposedly taken offline. I don't know of any evidence that actual oil production was affected, but it sure as heck impacted their business operations for quite some time. It was a major restoration activity. So kind of going forward, we see a very similar attack now out of the Middle East, but in the Korean Peninsula, this Dark Soul attack, which is very likely the North Koreans going after the South Koreans. And Andrea will talk a little bit more about that continuing back and forth here in a minute. But again, they timed this attack to have create maximum chaos, maximum simultaneous events targeting finance and media. Again, destroy files with overwrites. And then go ahead and actually destroy master boot records, reboot computers. Things are inoperable. Huge pain in the butt to restore from that. This knocked ATMs offline in South Korea, knocked some media outlets off the air for a short period of time. So again, secondary real-world effects based on this destructive malware that looks a lot like other wiping type of attacks. So jumping forward to 2014. What did we see? Kind of some hilarity with back and forth, cyber destructive attack as a response to something somebody doesn't like. The first example targeted the Sands Casino, and this is very likely another Iranian attack with malware. In this case, Sheldon Adelson, billionaire head of the Sands Casino conglomerate, he's a bit of an Iran hawk. He thinks we should push back a little harder on their nuclear program, and made some statements to the effect of, we got to puff our chest out, show them who's boss. Maybe we should go take a nuke out to the deserts in Nevada, blow it up to show the Iranians what will happen if they don't stop. So you can imagine that maybe the Iranians didn't really appreciate that, and they actually, in response to that, went right back at him, and it disrupted operations of the Sands Casino in very substantial ways, taking out 75% of their systems with, again, wiper-style malware, but also stealing data, releasing some employee data online, defacing websites in this case with some nice messages like, don't let your tongue cut your own throat, and, any threatened, use of weapons of mass destruction for any reason is a crime, things of that nature. So kind of getting some messaging in with that. And then another great one that a lot of people I bet have heard of is this, the Guardians of Peace, later very tightly connected to the Lazarus Group or North Korean hackers, responding to Sony because they didn't like a movie created by the guys behind South Park that talked about, it was all about assassinating Kim Jong-un, ridiculous comedy. I guess Kim Jong-un didn't appreciate that either and decided that the right proportional response was going at Sony hard with a cyber attack, stealing a lot of data, releasing unreleased films, all of their email servers, which you can imagine the chaos that creates if all your email goes online. You're doxxed broadly. And again, destructive attack, wiper, and destruction of MBRs. In that case, using the same, some of the same components that the Shamoon attacks had involved, same raw disk access driver, et cetera. So you're starting to see, cyber destruction as a response to something else, even something I didn't like that. I'm going to go pop you in the face with a cyber attack. So kind of getting away from that, but something I think a little more serious in terms of real world impact, an attack on a German steel mill in 2014. This one hasn't gotten a tremendous amount of press, but in this case, it looks, there's been some connections to Russian hacking groups doing this, state-sponsored hacking, getting access via spear phishing to a German steel mill, moving laterally, finding industrial control system components, kind of harkening back to the Stuxnet model where, hey, I can reach into a cyber system and do something to cause a real-world effect. In this case, they modified multiple components sort of regulating this giant blast furnace used by the steel production process. They knocked some of these things off. It created some cascading failures, and the thing basically blew up. So I don't think anybody died, but if anybody had been standing next to this thing, that would have been a real bad day. Some pretty serious real-world consequences. So in this case, hackers reaching in, manipulating control components, and causing this real-world impact. We saw more of that in 2015. The APT-28, again, Russian hacking group attacks the Ukraine power grid. You're starting to see this Russia-Ukraine thing really heating up and cyber activities going along with that. They went in. This was actually a pretty amazingly well-coordinated attack against their grid. About almost 250,000 people had no power for about like 1 to 6 hours, depending on things, before they could manually restore. But these guys, they went in. They clearly did reconnaissance for a while. They spearfished their way in. They got creds to a VPN, logged into the VPN, which gave them access to SCADA components, and did a lot of things. They first actually did a denial of service on the call center for these different electrical companies, so nobody could call and figure out what was going on or report anything. So kind of creating some chaos out at the outset. They went in. They basically broke some communications components, UPSs, connected to this stuff. They opened a bunch of breakers and did some other things that caused the electrical grid to fail. And as they got out, they actually overwrote firmware and some of the control components that were supposed to talk to these systems. So basically, they couldn't do restoration via cyber means at all because you could no longer communicate with any of the devices. Pretty well coordinated. 90 minutes after the attack started, they actually did a wiper attack, destroying systems throughout the network to make it even more difficult to do any kind of restoration, because all of a sudden the business side of the network starts going offline. So, a denial of service, multiple real-world effects through ICS components, and a wiper component, all coordinated at the same time. Pretty impressive attack, and maybe a harbinger of things to come in terms of level of sophistication. We also saw another interesting trend here, something called the Cyber Caliphate, had a French TV network called TV5 Monde taking 12 TV stations off air for almost a day. Oh, good. Well, yeah, the ICS components attached to the fire alarm system have been modified. All right.
These rivalries are basically between country pairs. That's what dyad or dyadic means. So between two groups of countries, these dyads that exist out there are disproportionately responsible for the number and amount of conflict in the world system. And so you can see the theories up there that, that these disputes are not insular events, but they're actually interconnected. They're starting to, the research is starting to stray a little bit from just the dyadic to the network aspect and system level, and we'll talk about that a little bit as far as you see these dyads are starting to become more, having regional consequences. And so these findings, going back to several hundred years, coding all the different data in the world based on whether there's conflict between these two groups of countries, does show that they are disproportionately responsible for conflict. And as it turns out, these dyads, the ones that are some of the most conflict prone, also are the ones using wiper malware right now. So we'll walk through some of the more common rivalries as they pertain to wiper malware. So Russia and Ukraine is no surprise. The interesting thing about this one, and I'll go through some different power symmetries between each of the three use cases. We'll do Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Koreas. With this one, you've got a major power on a minor power. And so what you start seeing in 2014 is basically for Russia, it's an extension. It goes back to 2007 with Estonia, if not even sooner, for a lot of their activities. But we see within Ukraine, you see a switch from a pro-Russian leader over to more of a pro-EU integration leader. And following that, you start seeing that leader was ousted by parliament. You have elections occurring in 2014. And this is really a case where Russia almost did stop the elections during this time. They actually did get into the ballot system. They had to delete everything and reboot just in time for the elections to actually occur. So Russian interference in elections is not anything new by any stretch. At the same time, you start seeing there also were information campaigns going on basically after the election saying that the pro-Russian candidate won. And then you have the annexation of Crimea during this time. That was also coupled with major DDoS attacks and other kinds of attacks at the same time. And so that's where you start seeing this evolution into hybrid warfare where there's a digital domain integrated with more physical kinetic kind of conflict at that time. Russia obviously wasn't done then. In 2015, more local elections. Right around that time, again, major attacks going on, this time targeting more of the news and media industries going on along with the government entities. And then you've got the attack on the energy grid during that time, right as the holidays were picking up. And that's, again, Mark talked about for some of these, a lot of these as we go along are aimed to augment the amount of impact based on holidays and those kind of events or downtime. You get into 2016, and the Ukrainian president has basically said, we're under a digital blitzkrieg during 2016. They've been attacked a ton throughout the entire year, not just these major ones that you're hearing about. He said something like, there were tens of thousands of attacks on about 36 different organizations over a 2-month period alone just during last year. And so it's really picking up. The targets are expanding. You get the shipping industry, you got financial industries, you got media, obviously in the public sector as well. You get the attack there, and then 2017, you've got NotPetya coming on targeting Ukraine, then spreading globally. There were additional sanctions thinking about on Russia for some of this activity, and so it's been one major escalation between those two countries. For Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit of a different story. So this is where you got a peer-to-peer country and more of a tit-for-tat behavior. And Mark talked about a lot of stuff leading up to it. So what I'll point out is, in 2012, Iran CERT issued a warning over the wiper malware. And so you start seeing the tension starting to rise during that, following those attacks, and they get Shamoon. And after that, though, there was a relative lull, at least in the digital domain. During that time, there still was plenty of proxy wars. If you think about Syria and Yemen, but with the 2015 nuclear deal, you can think about that, and the rest of the region felt a little uncomfortable, to say the least, with some of that aspects of it. And so following that, 2016, again, you see the headlines. You're calling digital warfare is going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, those are the kind of headlines that are getting pushed out there for 2016. On top of that, you see the Iranian pipeline explosions. And so the thing to point out here, it has not, at least from anything that I've seen, there have been discussions on whether it's a cyber attack or not. It's not been confirmed. But when it comes to rivalries, it doesn't always matter whether that's happened or not. That's the perception is there. That is what will guide behavior within the conflict. So then you see Shamoon. And finally, 2017, you see Stone Drill and Shamoon. And at the same time, we see everything going on right now with some of the proxies of Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the UAE and Qatar tensions that are going on, and the planning of the fake news after the intrusion. And so that's what's going on with this one. And again, a lot of it timed around some of these major events. But it is much more targeted, and that's part of the difference between here, at least over the years, with it being targeted. You compare that to North Korea, which really has not had any kind of constraint with the kind of attacks that they've had. And so, while many point to Stuxnet as one of the first, and the first major destructive malware, North Korea had some back in 2009, which doesn't really get talked about a ton, and it was part of a botnet worm that propagated. It hit first the U.S. on July 4th, again, the theme of kind of the events, and then spread to South Korea. During that time, what happened during that same year, that was the end of the Six Nation peace talks. So that's something to keep in mind. And the nuclear testing began again in 2009 in North Korea. And so you see the tensions going on there, and you see the response it was linked to the North Korean side, being linked to those kind of changes in the international system that are going on. Increased tension going on, 2010, 2011. 2011 still had another wiper attack linked to North Korea, this time really having an impact on the South Korean financial system. During that time, there were torpedo launches and some failed ones. And again, more of this tit-for-tat going on between those two countries. Another nuclear test in 2013, and there's another one in 2016. Keep in mind, you get the sanctions. The joint exercises that occurred during 2013 is around the same time as some of the attacks that happened. And so you've got, again, all these things going on as far as the different events. You can start linking those to when some of the wiper malware or destructive malware was deployed. Skip through some of the other things we know about Sony. 2015, War of the Words, basically blasting propaganda across the DMZ at each other. There were some casualties, some minor casualties between the two countries as far as some exchange of fire. And again, we had SWIFT, that we started, basically an $81 million bank heist going on. That was more globally. And so we started seeing, really following that malware in 2013, a much more easing of tensions on the digital domain as far as South and North Korea, still heating up a bit on the political front. And North Korea starts looking actually even broader. And one of the reasons could be that within South Korea there's a whole corruption crisis that they could very well, from the North Korean perspective, be taking care of themselves as far as leading to instability and so forth. And then 2017, when the DHS CERT just recently issued a warning for Hidden Cobra, and there includes everything from DDoS to wiper malware as a warning. And so they're still very, very active, enough so that there was a warning issued. And so now, Mark, will go ahead and look ahead.
Yeah, cool. So, what's next? It's we don't have a lot of super bold predictions here because largely this isn't broke, it's working. These techniques we talked about, both targeting the grid, targeting endpoint computers, they're all working. So I think we should expect to see the attacks kind of following very similar paths. however, some of these countries involved in these attacks are probably emboldened by the lack of any real consequences to their actions, both destroying computers and also probing at things like television stations, power grids, steel mills, things like that. Some of these attacks, you can't even really figure out why they'd be specifically targeted. And so the thought that pops into my mind is that there may be just sort of testing out tools, making sure they actually work in the wild, and then putting them in the toolbox for a rainy day when conflicts might escalate further. They may have to deploy them more broadly. And as these geopolitical strains increase, kind of feels like the consequences or give a crapness about getting caught. Maybe that starts to go away. Maybe we start to see more of these real world physical attacks where tools just get kind of used on a proof of concept basis. I think we're going to see a lot deception, and perhaps like ransomware being included in ransomware as a cover for action. I mean, irreversible, encryption, yeah, it can be reversible, but if you don't have the encryption key, it's like effectively data destruction. So we may see more ransomware without reversible encryption or provided keys start to become the norm for when we're going after computers themselves, as opposed to just overwriting files. We'll probably see more collateral damage and things like that. Which organizations? We're going to see a lot of the same. We've seen, we talked about energy sector, finance, the public sector, all these institutions where, if computers go down, business operations cease. There's going to be, confidence undermined, ability to have sort of strategic messaging about why things are happening, defacements to go along with these attacks. All of that's going to continue. Strategic targets, that's even you might call some of these things tactical, but we saw a lot of, in the minds of probably North Korea and Iran, very successful operations in response to statements and things they don't like that are totally outside the cyber domain, with the response coming, through the cyber domain. We'll probably see more of that. It's like, hey, this is in my toolbox, as a government of ways I can respond even to things totally outside the cyber realm, creating some destructive effects.
All right, then we'll get which kind of groups of countries might be next. India and Pakistan also comes to mind the fastest, which is increasingly worrisome given that they've got the nuclear weapon issue on both sides. But what's going on already with it? We are already seeing that they're following a path that's very similar to what we've seen in some of the other countries. This would be more of a peer-to-peer, like we see with Saudi Arabia and Iran. But we've already been seeing an uptick of DDoS attacks, and then just in this year, there's been some sightings of ransomware used against between the two countries. And so, given the historical animosity going on, a lot of the other geopolitical tensions going on, they seem like a prime candidate if we were to be forecasting which rivals might be next. Israel, Iran, it seems like the natural just progression of what's already going on within the Middle East. And then one of the more interesting questions, why not the U.S. and China? And I don't think they would be right, that group would be right now, for a large reason that thinking about all this goes back to strategic objectives, right? And so for China right now to attack the U.S. in this area, given the economic interdependencies, given honestly some of the instability already going on right now within our own system, China can basically just step back for a little while and see what's going on while continuing other kinds of attacks. So this isn't saying that that there won't be any kind of cyber espionage and those kind of things. It's basically saying that the implementation of destructive malware is not necessarily in China's interest or in the U.S.'s interest right now. And so when that changes, when that calculus changes, that's when there's a reason for concern. And at the same time, if you look at all the different, 3 different case studies we did, the U.S. is getting drawn into each of those as well. So you start seeing some of those system effects for more of the U.S. And then finally, when? And this is hopefully a theme that we hit upon a little bit, had to breeze through a little bit. Holidays are a big time. Elections are a big time. Think about agreements and summits. We start seeing a range of just more cyber attacks in general during some of these. Think like joint exercises, those kind of things. And then the sanctions will end with that because today the House is voting on potential increase in sanctions onto Russia, Iran, and North Korea across each of those dyads we've talked about. And so it'll be interesting to see, one, if that passes, and then if so, if there is any kind of response in this area. So that's something to keep an eye on. So we'll end now a little bit over our time, but if there are questions, be happy to take them. I'm supposed to be doing this now.
Sorry, I didn't realize you had to pass the mic. You mentioned that there's a lack of consequences for probing networks, especially probing civilian networks. What effect, how much of this do you think is caused by the NSA's refusal to allow espionage and non-fully destructive activities into the Tallinn definition of the use of force in the digital realm, since that was a NATO combined exercise?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about for the talent, and so there is still discussion. So you get the informal and the formal aspects of whether countries even have to adhere to that, right? So there's all that. So yeah, that's exactly part of the issue, right? So whether you're adhering to that, so it is there is discussion at the UNGGE, the norms just fell apart. That discussion as far as whether or not destruction actually does get categorized as, with a physical effect, then get categorized as a point of war. I just don't think there's follow-through yet from the governments to be able to want to respond given those kind of things. So the interesting thing that's just been coming out lately is that, so Ukraine, some of this has been impacted the Ukrainian hospitals. Well, Ukraine and Russia are technically at war by most accounts, and so that makes it a war crime, right? And there have been a couple articles over the last week talking about that. And so...
It's not a war crime if there's equivalent strategic benefits. It's only a war crime if there's a direct attack.
Well, we work on it, and that's why, I mean, it's fuzzy right now, and that's policy in all these areas is really lagging behind, and that, I mean, I could 100% whole another talk on that. I mean, some of the policies going out, whether they're not, the countries don't actually have to adhere to it. It's very informal. They're trying to build the norms to try and categorize what is and is not acceptable. But I think it is lagging behind it. Even if you put the document out there, like, so NATO's got Article 5, right? It has a cyber attack on one, it's a cyber attack on all. It has the definitions, yeah.
The NSA observers at the Tuscany conference specifically blocked the adding espionage to the use of force definitions. We never even got the opportunity to build a norm against that.
Right, and that's what I won't speak to anything that the NSA does. We're not associated with them, but there are competing interests within the U.S. and within all these other countries as well that further complicates the entire ways to have to follow through with all these things. So I think it's a fair point, and I absolutely think that there's a lot to be done on the international arena to actually hold accountability in this area. And until we actually do move forth in that area, it's not going to happen. And there are different groups, both within Western democracies and within authoritarian regimes that also are holding up part of these processes. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks, everyone.